Hello everybody and welcome to History Bite number 86, dated October 19th, 2020. I'm Walter, your mobile historian and blue-collar scholar. This History Bite is entitled Maryland's Orphans Courts. In Maryland, the Orphans Courts are our very limited jurisdiction trial courts responsible for only administering matters of probate. If you have never heard the word probate before in your life or are unfamiliar with it in its entirety but have heard the word before, quite simply, probate is a legal process, one that is responsible for administering the estate of an individual after their death, okay? If one has a last will and testament, okay, probate proves that your will is legally valid and therefore enforceable in a court of law, and thus executes your instructions and pays applicable taxes, okay, that you may owe on said estate, all right? So with that in mind, the Orphans Courts here in Maryland do indeed preside over the administration of estates, okay? They supervise the management of estates for people who have died, whether or not they have a will, okay, while owning property solely in their name, okay? Orphans Courts have the authority to direct conduct for the personal representatives of estates and have jurisdiction over the guardianship of property of minors, okay? And in some jurisdictions, they appoint the guardians of minors, okay? So, in sum, all right, when an individual dies, okay, they are known as a decedent, okay? And when they own property that does not automatically transfer to another individual by way of the law, okay, and that could be jointly owned property or property held in trust, okay, so it doesn't automatically transfer, these assets are referred to typically as probate assets, okay? And because of that, an estate has to be opened. Now, an estate, you might be thinking, is something ginormous, like, a huge mansion and 500 acres. But no, an estate, okay, has no minimum or maximum size. An estate could be something as small as one car, okay? Or it could be a vast mansion with 1,000 acres surrounding it, okay? An estate could be worth as little as $1,000, or it could be worth as much as $100 million. It honestly does not make a difference, okay, how small or large the estate is, okay? The bottom line is that when a decedent, okay, passes away and they have assets that do not automatically transfer to a beneficiary or heir of some kind, the laws here in Maryland provide for an orderly transfer of said assets, okay? And these proceedings are known as probate proceedings, all right? Now, probate typically is not, a sailor's knot complicated type of legal process. It has rules of administration. It's not overly difficult, but it's not crystal clear simple all the time, either. So, but I'm not going to get too heavy into that. I am not a probate attorney or an attorney of any kind, okay? That's not my domain to provide in-depth advice on probate matters, but I did provide you with the simple basics of what probate is so that you can have an understanding of what the Orphans Courts do, all right? They don't just sit there and look pretty. They actually deal with real-world circumstances, okay? So they are very old and have a very long history in the state of Maryland. And every county and Baltimore City, all right, with the sole exception of Montgomery and Harford counties, have Orphans Courts, all right? So Montgomery and Harford counties, the circuit court judges sit as Orphans Court judges and thus have the probate jurisdiction, okay? Orphans Court judges typically are appointed by the governor when vacancies happen, always appointed when vacancies happen, but rather they typically attain their offices by way of direct popular election, okay? Once the governor appoints them, okay, they must run for election every 4 years to retain their seats, okay? And once again, those terms of those seats can be renewed every 4 years. They can run to retain those offices. Now, Orphans Court judges, like circuit court judges, can be challenged directly by outside attorneys for their seats in office, okay? So, like circuit court judges, an incumbent Orphans Court judge can be defeated at the polls, and then that outside individual becomes the new judge, all right? Before 2014, Orphans Court judges in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and Prince George's counties did not have to be lawyers. That's right. An individual could run for an Orphans Court judgeship in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and Prince George's County and not be a lawyer. Thus, if the voters elected them, they would be qualified under the law to serve as a judge of the Orphans Court, regardless of how much they knew about probate law. Okay, so I'll admit to you here, way back in, I think it was 2004, I considered doing that very thing and running for an Orphans Court judgeship in Baltimore County, but wiser heads told me that it would be a pretty much fruitless endeavor for me to attempt such a thing at that time, being only 19 years old. And I'll add that at that time, I know for a fact that at least 1 to 2 of the Orphans Court judges in Baltimore County were not lawyers. Okay, so hopefully they had lots of real-world experience in dealing with probate matters and serving as a judge. Okay, serving as judges in spite of not being members of the Maryland bar. But at this point, all Orphans Court judges in Maryland are now required to be attorneys. So a state constitutional amendment changed that for Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and Prince George's County. So all the Orphans Court judges here are now attorneys, okay? Now, in those 3 jurisdictions I just mentioned, Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and Prince George's County, Orphans Court judges sit individually to preside over cases. But in all other jurisdictions that have Orphans Courts, they sit in 3-judge panels, okay? So every jurisdiction in Maryland that has an Orphans Court, there are 3 Orphans Court judges for every place that has an Orphans Court. Remember, Montgomery and Harford counties, circuit court judges deal with probate. So for everywhere else in Maryland, there are 3 Orphans Court judges per jurisdiction. In Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and Prince George's County, they sit individually. And everywhere else that has an Orphans Court, they sit in 3-judge panels. All right. And so with the Orphans Courts, you have an orderly administration of estates, orderly administration of the estates of individuals upon their death. All right. So that is the sole form and function of the Orphans Courts. All right. And the etymology behind the name Orphans Courts is derived from, obviously, quite a few years back, probably the 18th century, all right, when these courts, and it still exercises that power to appoint guardians for minors in certain circumstances with respect to estates, okay? And these minors were obviously orphans, hence the name Orphans Courts. Thus, but I'll say these courts also exercised more jurisdiction than just appointing the guardians for minors, all right, with respect to these estates. So in sum, like I said, the Orphans Courts in Maryland are responsible for supervising the management of estates for people who have died, whether or not they have a will and own property in their sole name, okay? And the Orphans Courts ensure that when individuals, okay, who have property die, okay, they're known as a decedent, When a decedent has property that does not automatically transfer to a beneficiary or heir by way of the law, okay? Maryland's law provides for an orderly transfer of those assets to the appropriate person or persons. These proceedings are known as probate proceedings, all right? And they are handled by our orphans courts. Thank you so much for listening to this History Bite. If you have any questions or controversies, leave them down below. I'll be happy to answer them. Oh, and one more thing, all right? In my last year of high school, I interned with the Orphans Court for Baltimore City under the supervision of the Honorable Lewin Scott Garrett. All right? Just thought I'd throw that in there as well. He's a great guy. All right? So, again, thank you for listening to this History Bite. Take care. Stay safe out there. And I'll talk to you at the next one. Peace.